My name is Naomi Carter. I sat behind the bench with my spine straight and my hands resting lightly on the polished wood, but inside, something small and ancient was trembling. The courtroom was quiet in that pre-hearing stillness where even breathing felt like a disruption. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A ceiling fan clicked every few rotations. The air smelled faintly of paper, floor cleaner, and the wool coat of the woman sitting in the first row, across the aisle. The plaintiffs laughed with their attorney, a man and a woman in their early 60s, well-dressed, well-fed, comfortable, the kind of people who belonged in country clubs and charity galas, not in family court suing for emotional damages. The man's watch gleamed when he lifted his wrist. The woman's pearl necklace sat perfectly centered on her collarbone. They looked happy. They looked entitled. They did not look like people who had lost a child. The bailiff stepped forward. "All rise," he announced. The Honorable Judge Naomi Carter presiding. The room stood. The plaintiffs turned toward the door, expecting someone else. Their smiles were already practiced, sympathetic, respectful, ready to greet the stranger who would decide their case. Then I stood. Their expressions faltered, but only for a moment. They did not recognize me. Not yet. Why would they? They had last seen me when I was too small to form full sentences, too small to defend myself, too small to be remembered as anything more than an inconvenience. I walked to the bench. Every step felt like walking through water, heavy, slow. I could hear the click of my heels on the tile. I could hear the rustle of my robe. I could hear the faint gasp of someone in the gallery as I passed. I took my seat. The plaintiff's attorney froze halfway through opening his folder. The woman's lips parted slightly. The man squinted, confused, as if searching for familiarity that refused to surface. I lifted my eyes to them, steady and neutral. Courtroom neutrality is a skill. It is something you learn after years of watching people beg, lie, bargain, and break in front of you. You learn to become still water. You learn not to flinch. But today, the stillness had a pulse, because in my robe pocket, beneath the thin cotton lining, my fingers curled around a strip of plastic sealed in a small clear sleeve, a hospital wristband, faded white, black printed text, barely legible, a barcode worn down by time. It was the only physical proof of my first day on Earth, the only thing tying me to a name I once had and a family that never came back. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. Its weight was burned into my palm. The clerk began reading the case. Number: Carter Family Court Petition for Wrongful Separation and Financial Restitution. Plaintiffs: Daniel and Lorraine Carter. Respondent: Estate of Luis Mendoza. Interested party: Naomi Carter. My stomach tightened, but my face remained still. Daniel Carter. Lorraine Carter. The names matched the file that had landed on my desk 3 weeks ago, the one that had made me close my office door and sit in silence for an hour. The one that contained a birth certificate, my birth certificate. The plaintiffs had come for money, for inheritance, for a claim they believed no one could contest. They believed the child they left behind had disappeared into the system, that she had become a statistic, a ghost. They never considered she might grow up, that she might study, that she might build a life, that she might one day wear the robe they now faced. The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, "my clients have endured 33 years of unimaginable grief." I lifted one hand. "Before we proceed," I said, my voice even, "I will review the procedural facts for the record." The attorney paused, startled, then nodded. I opened the file in front of me. The paper edges were crisp, official, impersonal, a life reduced to ink. Daniel Carter and Lorraine Carter, I read, filed this petition claiming wrongful loss of their minor daughter in 1998. They assert emotional damages and seek restitution from the estate of Luis Mendoza, alleging unlawful interference with parental custody. I looked up. Their eyes were locked on me now, not smiling, not relaxed, studying, trying to place me. Lorraine's hand tightened around her purse strap. Daniel leaned forward slightly, as if proximity would unlock memory.it. Didn't, because memory is a luxury they never bothered to keep. I continued. The court recognizes the seriousness of claims involving child separation and identity disputes. This hearing will proceed under full evidentiary review. I paused deliberately. Silence stretched, the same silence that had once swallowed me in a building full of strangers. But here, in this room, silence belonged to me. I looked directly at the plaintiffs, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. I said, "Before we begin, I want to clarify one matter." Their attorney stiffened. "Yes, Your Honor?" I placed both hands flat on the bench. "Are you certain," I asked, "that you wish to proceed under oath with all statements subject to perjury law?" Daniel Carter swallowed. Lorraine Carter nodded too quickly. "Yes," Daniel said. "We want justice." I held his gaze. "So do I." The words were neutral, but something in the room shifted. A current passing. Beneath tile and wood and human skin, they still didn't know who I was, but they were starting to sense that this case would not unfold the way they expected. I closed the file gently. "We will begin with opening statements," I said, and as the attorney stood, I loosened my grip on the wristband in my pocket, letting it rest flat against my palm like a promise. The game had started, and this time, I knew all the rules, but in 1998, no one called me that. In 1998, I was just baby girl, printed in black ink on a plastic hospital band that wrapped around my ankle too loosely. It slid down often, and the volunteer would lift it back up, smiling softly, telling me I was a regular. I didn't know what that meant. I only knew the room was warm and smelled like laundry soap and powdered milk. The place wasn't an orphanage, not officially. It was a temporary care booth, a charity-run program inside a downtown hospital. Parents who were overwhelmed, desperate, or in crisis could leave their infants there for short-term care. No paperwork, no police, no shame. Just a promise that the child would be safe until they returned. It was meant for emergencies, not disappearances. I was left there on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. I know because the intake log recorded the weather in the margin, a habit of the nurse on duty, who liked details. She wrote, "Heavy rain, mother nervous, father silent." They told the volunteer they would be back in an hour. They didn't kiss me goodbye. They didn't hug me. They just set my carrier on the floor, signed a clipboard with fake contact information, and walked out. The volunteer on shift was named Marisol. She told me this story years later, when I was old enough to ask. She said my mother looked at the door twice before stepping through it, not in regret, in calculation, like someone leaving behind a suitcase that cost too much to carry. Hours passed. No1 returned. By midnight, Marisol had already called the number on the clipboard. Disconnected. She contacted the hospital's social services. They told her to keep me overnight. Someone would follow up in the morning. Morning came. No1 called. No1 arrived. No frantic parents stormed in, crying, apologizing, desperate to hold me. By afternoon, the volunteer shift changed. Marisol went home. I stayed. It was Luis Mendoza who found me. He was the janitor assigned to the pediatric wing. He pushed a squeaky mop bucket that always sloshed too loudly. He wasn't supposed to interact with patients, but he noticed a crib that had been in the same spot for too long. He told me he heard the quiet before he saw me. A silence that didn't belong in a room meant for short-term care. Silence means someone didn't come back. He stood there for a long time, just watching, making sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. A baby, alone, still wearing a wristband. No chart, no bag, no parents. He reported it to security. Then he stayed, not required, not paid, just stayed. He stood beside that crib until social services arrived. He stood there when they transferred me to a temporary ward. He stood there when they declared me an unclaimed child. He stood there when they assigned me a case number instead of a name. He kept showing up, every day. He brought a small stuffed rabbit he bought from a discount store. He placed it beside me and said in soft Spanish, "You will not be invisible." He didn't know then how true that promise would become. Foster care moved slowly. Paperwork, approvals, home studies. Months passed. No1 came looking for me. No missing child reports surfaced. No photographs circulated. No news alerts. It was as if I had never existed. That was the first quiet lesson I learned in life. If someone wants you erased badly enough, the world will help them. By the time I was 9 months old, Luis had filed the paperwork to become my legal guardian. He was not wealthy. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery. He worked 2 cleaning jobs. He had arthritis in his left knee. He spoke English slowly, but he had one thing the system recognized as invaluable: consistency. He had visited every single day since the day I was found. So the court approved him. I was given a name, Naomi Carter, the last name. chosen by social services because no father's name was listed and no claim had been made. A random file designation turned into my identity. Luis didn't change it. He said names are roots, even if they grow in strange soil. My childhood was not glamorous. It was early mornings with Luis tying my shoes before school. His fingers stiff from cleaning chemicals. It was dollar store notebooks. It was homework done at a kitchen table with one flickering overhead bulb. It was Luis reading library books out loud with a thick accent, pausing to sound out words together with me. He taught me how systems work, not with lectures, with life. He showed me how paperwork decides who belongs where, how documents open doors or close them, how signatures can change destinies. When I was 12, he took me to the courthouse, where he worked part-time cleaning floors. He pointed at the judges' benches and said, "People think power lives there, but power lives in files." I believed him. So I studied. I read every form I was ever given. I asked questions teachers didn't expect. I watched how adults talked when they thought children weren't listening. By the time I graduated high school, I knew exactly what I wanted. Law. Not because I wanted power, because I wanted language, structure, rules, weapons made of words. Luis cried quietly at my graduation. He tried to hide it behind his jacket sleeve. When I got my law school acceptance letter, he framed it and hung it in the living room above the rabbit he had saved from the crib. Days. He never told me much about the day he found me, not until I was in my second year of law school. We were eating rice and beans when I finally asked, "Did anyone ever come looking for me?" He put down his fork. "No," he said. "Never? Never." That was all. No bitterness, no drama, just fact. And that was when I understood the final piece of my origin story. I had not been lost. I had been discarded. Luis died on a quiet Sunday morning when I was 28. Heart failure. No warning. No spectacle. At his small funeral, there were 3 co-workers, 2 neighbors, and me. No family. No dramatic eulogies, just a priest, a box of ashes, and the rabbit on the casket. I went home after, sat in our apartment, and listened to the silence settle. It was a familiar silence, but this time, I was not afraid of it, because silence can mean absence, or it can mean space to build. I became a judge at 32, one of the youngest in the county. Luis never saw me take the bench, but I carried him there anyway, every day. In the form of a plastic hospital wristband, sealed in my robe pocket, not as a wound. As evidence. And now, decades after a rainy afternoon in a hospital hallway, 2 people had walked into my courtroom asking for restitution for a daughter they claimed was stolen, a daughter they had never looked for, a daughter they had erased so completely, they didn't even recognize her sitting in front of them. There are people who change your life with grand gestures. Luis Mendoza changed mine with small, repetitive acts that never made headlines. He woke before dawn every day, not because he loved mornings, but because 2 cleaning jobs paid better than 1. I used to hear his keys jingle softly as he tried to leave without waking me, but I always woke anyway. Because I learned early that the sound of someone leaving can mean 2 different things. Some people leave and never come back. Luis always came back. I would lie in bed and listen for the door in the evening. The slow turn of the lock. The soft sigh he made when he stepped inside. That sound became my definition of safety. We didn't talk much about the day he found me, but we talked about everything else. He taught me how to budget with envelopes of cash on the kitchen table, rent, food, school, supplies, emergency, a system built on discipline, not abundance. He taught me how to fix a dripping faucet because, as he said, if you wait for someone else to save you, you will stay waiting. He taught me how to apologize only when I meant it, how to look people in the eyes, how to speak slowly when something mattered, but most of all, he taught me to pay attention. People tell you the truth, he used to say, not with words, with patterns. I didn't know it then. But he was teaching me how to be a judge long before I knew I wanted to be one. When I was 10, I asked him why he never had children before me. He didn't answer immediately. He was washing dishes. His hands moved steadily through the warm water. Finally, he said, "Some people get children by chance. I got mine by choice." That was Luis. He never let me call him dad. Not because he didn't want it, but because he said names carry history, and he didn't want to erase mine. "You will decide who you are," he told me, "not someone else." At school, When teachers asked where my parents were, I learned to answer. My guardian works 2 jobs. I learned to say it without shame, because Luis never carried shame. He carried responsibility. When I was 13, a social worker visited to check on the foster placement. Standard procedure. She asked questions from a clipboard. Was I fed? Did I attend school? Was I safe? Then she asked the question that mattered. Do you know what happened to your biological parents? I said, no. She looked at Luis. He said, no one ever came. That was it. No mystery. No tragedy. Just absence. That night, I sat on the floor with the stuffed rabbit Luis had bought me as a baby. Its fabric was worn thin, one eye missing. I pressed it to my chest and understood something quietly and completely. If they wanted me, they would have come. That thought hurt less than wondering. Truth is often kinder than hope. High school was my proving ground. I didn't have legacy. I didn't have money. I didn't have a family name that opened doors. So I built my own credentials. I stayed late in the library. I argued with debate coaches. I read law cases for fun. I volunteered at legal aid clinics just to listen. Luis never once asked if I was doing too much. He only asked if I was doing what mattered. When my acceptance letter to Northwestern Law arrived, he placed it on the table and stared at it for a long time. You will wear a robe one day, he said. I laughed. He didn't. Law school was brutal. Not because the material was impossible, but because I was surrounded by students whose parents were lawyers, judges, donors, board members. They spoke the language of power like they had inherited it in their DNA. I learned it like a second language. I worked in the library. I tutored undergraduates. I cleaned my own apartment. I lived with roommates. I stretched every dollar. Luis visited once a month, bringing homemade food and quiet pride. He never sat in my tiny apartment for more than an hour. He said, "You have studying. I have floors." He was proud of cleaning floors, because floors hold people up. He liked that. The night before my bar exam, I called him. "I'm scared," I admitted. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "When I found you, you were silent. You didn't cry. You just watched." And I thought, this child is paying attention. So pay attention tomorrow. Not to fear, to questions. I passed. The day I got my results, he bought a small cake from the bakery downstairs. We ate it with plastic forks. No big celebration. Just 2 people at a table. Knowing something important had happened, when I was appointed to the bench, Luis sat in the back row of the courtroom during my swearing in. He wore his best shirt. His hands were folded. He didn't clap loudly. He just watched, the same way he watched me in a hospital crib all those years ago. When I hugged him afterward, he whispered, "You are visible." That was his greatest gift. Not food, not shelter, not even education, visibility. 6 months later, he died, heart failure in his sleep. When I cleaned out his apartment, I found a single file in a drawer. Inside was a photocopy of my hospital intake record, the original charity care sheet, my hospital wristband number, the date, the time, the words, child unclaimed. Luis had kept it, not as bitterness. As proof. He knew that one day, I might need it. He was right, because now, in my courtroom, to strangers with familiar names were asking the law to return a daughter they claimed was stolen, a daughter they never bothered to search for, a daughter who sat behind the bench, wearing the robe, holding the silence. I first heard the word inheritance in relation to my life 3 weeks after Luis died. The letter arrived in a thick cream envelope with a law firm's seal embossed in gold. It sat on my kitchen table for an hour before I opened it, because grief makes even paper feel dangerous. When I finally tore the flap, I expected instructions about his ashes or a small savings account, something symbolic. Instead, I found a meeting request, estate disclosure appointment, Mendoza Financial Holdings. Read it twice. Then again, Luis Mendoza, hospital janitor, floor cleaner, my quiet guardian, who lived above a bakery and never owned more than 2 pairs of shoes at a time, financial holdings. I almost laughed. The meeting. 3 lawyers sat across from me in a glass office overlooking downtown Chicago. They spoke in gentle voices, the way people do when they think someone is fragile. Luis Mendoza, they explained, had been an early investor in medical equipment startups in the late 90s. He had received stock instead of payment for cleaning contracts when hospitals couldn't afford wages. He had quietly held those stocks, reinvested, compounded, trusted patience more than comfort. By the time he died, his portfolio was worth $8 million. He left $5 million to me, the rest to hospitals, shelters, and child legal aid funds. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I simply felt the world tilt, not because of greed, but because everything suddenly made sense. Luis had never cleaned floors just to survive. He had been building something invisible, a safety net, not just for me, but for children like me. He didn't rescue me from abandonment. He engineered my future. News travels fast when money appears. Within 48 hours, a local business journal published a small article. Unknown judge inherits multi-million-dollar estate from retired hospital worker. No photo, just my name, Naomi Carter. That was all it took. A name printed in public record, a trust unlocked, a dormant file in some distant cabinet suddenly flagged as valuable. 2 days later, the lawsuit arrived, delivered by courier, formal, cold, typed in legal language meant to sound compassionate. Daniel Carter and Lorraine Carter. Plaintiffs vs. Estate of Luis Mendoza and Naomi Carter. Interested party. They claimed I was their biological daughter. They claimed Luis had taken me. They claimed they had searched for decades. They claimed the trust rightfully belonged to them. And because I now sat on a bench, wearing a robe that symbolized justice, they believed fate had finally smiled on them. They believed the daughter they once erased had returned not as a child but as a vault. They did not know the lock had teeth. When I first saw the complaint, I didn't feel anger. I felt fascination. I read it like a judge reviews a defective contract. I noted the emotional language, the missing evidence, the reliance on sympathy over facts. It was a story, not truth, and stories can be dismantled. But there was one complication. I was the judge assigned to the case. By all ethical standards, I should have recused myself immediately. Conflict of interest, personal involvement, emotional stake. But if I stepped away too soon, I would lose the only advantage I had, time to investigate. Quietly, before revealing who I was. So I did what Luis taught me. I watched patterns. I allowed the hearing to proceed. I said nothing, and I began digging. I contacted a private records archivist I trusted from previous fraud cases. A woman named Tamsin Reed. Efficient, relentless, no curiosity, just results. Go back to 1998, I told her. Find any filings connected to Daniel and Lorraine Carter. Civil, criminal, insurance, hospital, everything. She didn't ask why. Professionals don't need reasons, they need instructions. While she searched, I sat in my chambers after hours, reading the original hospital intake log Luis had saved. Charity care booth, infant Indicino, parental ID verified. Temporary contact number disconnected. Child left with carrier and no belongings. No follow-up inquiries from guardians. No missing child reports filed. It was clean, too clean. A disappearance designed to leave no trail. But paperwork always leaves dust. You just need to know where to blow. 3 days later, Tamsin called. I found something, she said. And it's ugly. She arrived at my office with a laptop and a printed file. Insurance litigation. Daniel and Lorraine Carter vs. St. Agnes Medical Center. Claim. Emotional damages for lost infant due to negligent charity booth supervision. Settlement 600,000. And attached to the settlement, affidavit of parental lost child presumed unrecoverable. Presumed unrecoverable. Legal language for, we will take the money and never ask questions again. They had not searched. They had not posted missing child alerts. They had not hired investigators. They had filed an insurance claim. They had profited from my disappearance. And now, decades later, they had returned to profit again. I sat very still. Luis had called people like this predictable. Grifters don't change strategies. They only adjust targets. That night, I stood in my apartment holding the hospital wristband. The plastic had grown brittle. The ink faint. But it was still readable. Baby girl. Date. Time. Proof I had entered the world. Proof they had erased me. I thought of the silence of the charity booth. The hum of fluorescent lights. The volunteers' footsteps fading. And then Luis's keys in the lock. Some people abandon children. Some people choose them. The Carters had made their choice in 1998. Luis had made his. Now, in 2024, it was my turn. The next morning, I entered my courtroom as Naomi Carter, judge, but inside, something had shifted. I was no longer just presiding over a lawsuit. I was preparing a revelation, a legal ambush built from patience, documentation, and memory. They believed they were suing an orphan. They didn't know they were challenging the very child they once declared legally gone. And when the moment came, when the evidence unfolded, when the truth surfaced, the silence in that courtroom would belong to me, not to fear, not to abandonment, but to reckoning. I saw my parents again after 26 years. They were sitting in the front row of my courtroom. They didn't recognize me. Not really. They saw a judge in a black robe, hair pulled back, posture straight, expression unreadable. They saw authority, distance, power. They did not see the infant they once labeled unrecoverable. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. The ceiling lights were too bright, flattening everyone's features, exposing every flaw. Daniel Carter sat stiffly beside Lorraine, his hand resting possessively on her knee, like they were a united front. Their attorney leaned close, whispering strategy with the confidence of a man who believed this case was already won. Why wouldn't he? Two grieving parents, a mysterious dead benefactor, a wealthy young judge with no known family history. On paper, they were victims. On paper, I was an obstacle. Paper, however, had always been my battlefield. I took my seat behind the bench. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose. Daniel and Lorraine stood with the rest of the courtroom, their eyes fixed forward. Then, I stepped up. Not from the side entrance. Not from a back chamber. I walked through the door behind the bench and sat in the judge's chair. Lorraine's breath caught audibly. Daniel squinted. Their attorney froze. Mid-whisper, the courtroom settled, but the air had changed. Something unseen had entered the room. Not anger, not revenge, recognition. I struck the gavel once. Please be seated. My voice was calm, neutral, professional, but it was my voice, Lorraine's. Fingers tightened around her purse strap. Daniel's face shifted, confusion first, then irritation, as if I were a clerk sitting in the wrong seat. Their lawyer leaned toward them, whispering urgently. Lorraine shook her head slightly. Daniel's jaw worked. They still didn't know. Not yet. Proceedings began. Their attorney delivered an opening statement soaked in sorrow. He spoke of loving parents, of a stolen child, of decades of grief, of the miraculous discovery that their daughter had lived all along under the care of a man who wrongfully took her. He spoke of inheritance. He spoke of justice. He did not speak of evidence, because there was none. When he finished, I nodded politely. Defense opening? My own attorney stood, a man of few words chosen precisely because he did not overperform. He said only, "This case is not about emotion. It is about documentation, and documentation will be provided. Simple, clean, irrefutable." Lorraine dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, already damp from practice. Daniel stared at me like I was a puzzle missing a piece. They still didn't see the child. They saw only the judge. The first witness was Lorraine. She took the stand, hand on the Bible, voice trembling just enough to sound fragile, not unstable. She spoke of pain, of empty bedrooms, of sleepless nights, of unanswered prayers. She described the day she lost her baby at the hospital charity booth, how she turned away for only a moment, how the staff had been careless, how her world collapsed. She never mentioned the insurance lawsuit. She never mentioned the settlement. She never mentioned the affidavit. When she finished, the courtroom sat in heavy sympathy. Then it was time for cross-examination. My attorney stood. "Mrs. Carter, I'm going to show you a document. Please look at the highlighted section." A court clerk handed her the page, the 1999 settlement affidavit. Lorraine's eyes moved across the text. I watched her color drain. "Mrs. Carter," my attorney said gently, "is that your signature?" Silence. The courtroom leaned forward collectively. "Yes," she whispered, "and in this document, you state under oath that your child, Samantha Carter, was presumed unrecoverable. Correct?" Lorraine's breathing changed. Shallow, fast. "Yes. So in 1999, you legally accepted compensation for the permanent loss of your child?" "Yes," she whispered again. Weaker. My attorney nodded. No further questions. Lorraine stepped down from the stand like someone walking underwater. Daniel did not look at her. He looked at me, and now, finally, recognition sparked, because he knew what that document meant, and he knew I had it. Next came Daniel's testimony. He tried anger instead of sorrow. He spoke of injustice, of corruption, of a man who stole a child, of a system that failed him. He pointed at me once. This court must understand the emotional trauma my family endured. I raised a hand gently. Mr. Carter, you will address the court, not the judge personally. His attorney guided him back, but Daniel was rattled now. When my attorney presented the casino receipts dated 3 days after my disappearance, Daniel stumbled. He claimed they were fabricated, then claimed they were misunderstandings, then claimed he did not recall. Each answer made him smaller, not a grieving father, a man cornered by paper, and then, the final witness, my attorney said one name, Naomi Carter. A ripple passed through the room. Daniel's attorney stood. Abruptly, objection. I raised the gavel. Slightly, overruled. I stood and walked down from the bench. Every step echoed on the marble floor. I walked to the witness. Stand. Placed my hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat. The courtroom was silent, not the oppressive silence of abandonment, not the terrified silence of a lost child, a controlled silence, mine. My attorney asked softly, Miss Carter, can you state for the record your full name? Naomi Carter. Daniel inhaled sharply. Lorraine let out a broken sound. The courtroom murmured. My attorney continued, Miss Carter, do you recognize the plaintiffs? I turned toward them, looked directly into their eyes. I do. Daniel's lips parted. Lorraine's hand flew to her mouth. My attorney asked, and who are they to you? I let the silence stretch, just long enough, then answered, they are the people who signed a legal document declaring me dead. No shouting. Followed. No dramatic collapse. Just the slow realization spreading through the room. Like ink in water, the plaintiffs were not parents seeking justice. They were individuals who had profited from a child's disappearance and returned only when profit reappeared. My attorney asked a few final procedural questions. I answered each one calmly. Then I stepped down, walked back up the steps, sat behind the bench. Again, judge's robe settling around me like armor. I lifted the gavel. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that the plaintiffs lack standing. Case dismissed with prejudice. The gavel struck. Once. Final. Clean. Not revenge. Not rage. Just the law. Closing the door that should never have been reopened. When the courtroom cleared, I stayed seated, hands resting on the bench. Luisa's voice drifted through my memory. Some people build walls. Some people build doors. Make sure you know which one you're opening. Today, I had closed one. The courtroom emptied faster than I expected. People always imagine justice arriving with noise, with shouting, with breakdowns, with gasps and headlines and flashing cameras. But real justice is quiet. It sounds like chairs scraping backward, shoes crossing tile, a door closing, and finally nothing. When the last person left, I remained seated behind the bench. The bailiff paused at the door, unsure whether to speak, then simply nodded and shut it behind him. I was alone, not abandoned, alone by choice. I removed the robe and folded it carefully over the back of the chair. It felt heavier than it ever had before, not because of its fabric, but because of what had happened while I wore it. I walked to the window overlooking the city. Chicago stretched out below me, gray and silver under winter light. People crossing intersections, cars honking, lives moving forward without knowing that, in a small courtroom above them, 2 people had finally been held accountable for erasing a child. I thought I would feel victorious. I did not. I felt empty, not hollow in a painful way, empty like a vessel finally poured out after being carried too long. I drove home without music. Traffic flowed. Lights changed. The world behaved normally, as if nothing monumental had happened. A red light. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked the same as it had that morning. Same eyes, same mouth, same hair pulled back too tightly, but behind my eyes, something had loosened. A knot I didn't know was still there had finally untied. My apartment greeted me with familiar stillness. I kicked off my shoes, set my keys on the hook, hung my coat. Small rituals that remind the body it is safe. I walked to the kitchen and filled a glass with water. My hand trembled slightly as I lifted it to my lips. Not from fear, from release. When you spend a lifetime bracing for the moment someone will leave again, your body never truly rests. Even after you become strong, even after you become accomplished, even after you wear a judge's robe. Today, the original leaving had finally been answered, not by love, not by apology. By truth, and truth does not hug you. It simply stands. On my dining table lay the red wool scarf, the one item I had carried through every stage of my life, the one physical thread connecting the child in the charity booth to the woman in the courtroom. I picked it up. The wool was softer now with age, less scratchy, less defensive. I wrapped it around my neck and looked at myself in the kitchen window. Reflection, not to shield, not to remember pain, but to acknowledge survival. My phone buzzed. A message from my attorney. Da will be pursuing perjury and fraud charges. You're officially clear. Rest tonight. I stared at the words, clear, like a sky after storm, not happy, just free. Later that evening, I visited Luis's grave. It was a simple headstone in a small cemetery on the south side. No marble angels, no grand epitaphs, just Luis Mendoza 1939-2023. He chose to stay, stood there in the cold, breath rising in faint clouds. I did it, I whispered, not triumph, not pride, just completion. I imagined him leaning against a doorway somewhere, hands in his pockets, giving me that small nod he always did when I solved a problem on my own. No applause, no praise, just acknowledgement. On the walk back to my car, I realized something important. I had spent years believing the story ended with abandonment. Then, I believed it ended with rescue. Then I believed it ended with justice. But endings are not destinations. They are thresholds. And tonight, I was standing at a new one. No longer the abandoned child. No longer the rescued orphan. No longer the judge confronting ghosts. Just a woman, with a name, with a home, with a future. When I got back to my apartment, I placed the scarf in a drawer instead of hanging it by the door, not because I wanted to forget, but because I no longer needed armor. Before sleeping, I opened the Foundation's project file Luis had started but never lived to see finished. The Terminal Project, a legal protection network for children left in institutional gaps. I typed a single sentence at the top of the document. No child disappears quietly. Then I saved it, turned off the light, and slept without dreams for the first time in years. I learned that justice doesn't end when the gavel falls. It only changes shape. The first letter arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. I knew it was official mail before I even opened the envelope. Thick paper, government seal, the kind of correspondence that never carries good news for anyone on the receiving end. Notice of criminal indictment. Daniel and Lorraine Carter were being formally charged with perjury, insurance fraud, and falsifying sworn affidavits. I read the document twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel the weight of reality settling in. They weren't just publicly exposed now. They were legally cornered. I set the paper down and made tea. That had become my new ritual. When something large happened, I boiled water, watched steam rise, let my hands remember calm. The kettle whistled. I poured the water, wrapped my fingers around the mug, and for the first time, I thought not about the past but about what came next. Because winning a war doesn't automatically give you a home. It only gives you ground to build on. The Foundation office opened a week later. A modest space, 2 rooms, second-hand desks, windows overlooking an alley where pigeons ruled like small gray kings. Nothing impressive, nothing extravagant, but it was real. The Terminal Project. The name still felt strange on my tongue. A reminder of where everything began, and where no child should ever be left again. Tamsin Reed became our records director. Megan joined as lead caseworker. 2 law interns from Northwestern volunteered part-time. And me, Judge Naomi Carter by day, Director Naomi Carter by night. I split my life in halves. That finally felt aligned. One afternoon, a social worker dropped off our first client file. Child left at county intake desk. No parental follow-up. Age 4. I stared at the photo attached. A small boy clutching a backpack strap. Wide eyes. Tight mouth. The same posture I once had on a cold plastic bench. My chest tightened. But not with pain, with purpose. I closed the file gently. We would not let him become a ghost. That evening, Megan and I sat on my balcony with takeout cartons and cheap wine. City lights stretched around us. A warm breeze carried the sound of sirens far below, distant enough to be background noise, not danger. Megan leaned back in her chair. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if they hadn't done it? She asked quietly. I thought about it. A suburban childhood. A bedroom with posters. Parents at school recitals. College paid with honest money. No silence swallowing me whole. Yes, I said. Sometimes. Megan nodded. I used to imagine the same thing, she admitted. But now, I think I understand something. I turned to her. She smiled small, sincere. If they hadn't done what they did, you wouldn't be you. They simply acknowledge outcome. I raised my plastic cup. To strange math, I said. Megan clinked hers gently. To sisters who built themselves. Later that night, after Megan left, I opened the last remaining file from the investigation box. The 1999 settlement check. Copy. 600,000. The money that purchased my disappearance. The receipt of my erasure. I held it for a long time, then I fed it into the shredder. Not out of anger, but because that transaction no longer defined me. They had cashed my absence. Luis had invested in my presence, and I had turned survival into structure. The ledger was closed. A month later, I received one final message from Daniel Carter's court-appointed attorney. Mr. Carter wishes to request a private meeting. No legal agenda. Personal only. I stared at the email. For a moment, I felt 5 years old again. Sitting somewhere, waiting for adults to decide my fate. Then I closed the message. No reply. Some conversations are not owed. Some doors are meant to remain sealed. On a rainy Tuesday, I returned to the airport. Not O'Hare. A smaller regional terminal near the lake. Quiet, soft-lit, almost peaceful. I sat on a bench near the arrival gate, not to relive trauma, but to observe. A mother tying her daughter's shoelace. A father lifting his sleepy son into his arms. A teenage boy waving at grandparents through glass. Ordinary scenes. Sacred scenes. I sat there until my tea went cold in my hands. Then I stood, walked through the automatic doors, and stepped into the rain. Not escaping, not returning, just moving forward. That night, I hung the red scarf on a hook near my door. Not armor, not memory, just a piece of wool that had traveled with me from silence to speech, from loss to law, from ghost to woman. On the morning the verdict against my parents became public record, I woke before sunrise and listened to the city breathe. No alarms, no notifications, no courtroom schedule pulling me forward, just the hum of Chicago stretching awake beyond my window. I made coffee slowly, savoring the small domestic rhythm. Spoon against ceramic, steam rising, light pooling across the counter. The kind of quiet that once terrified me now felt like companionship. I opened my laptop and read the article that everyone else in the city was reading. Former couple indicted for insurance fraud in child disappearance casino. Mention of me by name. Just now adult daughter who testified. The story had become larger than my identity. It had entered public memory as cautionary history. They were no longer my parents. They were defendants, and I was no longer their consequence. I was simply myself. The foundation office. The staff had gathered around mismatched desks with morning pastries and paper cups of coffee. Tamsin was already sorting files. Megan was on the phone with a social worker. One of the interns waved at me like we were part of something normal, and we were. The first case we fully closed that week involved the little boy from the intake desk. His mother had been located. Addiction treatment arranged. Custody reunification plan approved. A future reconnected before it became a tragedy. I watched Megan walk him to the elevator later that afternoon. He clutched a stuffed dog and waved shyly. A child not lost. A story redirected. Luis would have liked that evening. I returned to the cemetery, not because I was sad, but because gratitude needs grounding. I placed a small bouquet of daisies at Luis's grave. Simple, honest, unremarkable. Like him. I kept the promise, I said quietly. And a wind answered. No dramatic sign, just stillness and peace. On the drive home, I stopped by a quiet bookstore. I didn't need anything. I just wanted to browse, to exist among people who didn't know my history. In the back corner, I found a children's book about a girl who got lost in an airport and found a new home. I read the first page, put it back. Some stories didn't need retelling. Mine had already been written in law, not paper. Later that night, I sat on my couch with the red scarf folded in my lap. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the bench, the fluorescent lights, the conveyor belt hum, the silence that swallowed a 5-year-old girl. Then I remembered the courtroom, the bench, the gavel, the silence that swallowed a lie. Same shape, different master. Silence had once been the place I disappeared. Now it was the space I commanded. I folded the scarf carefully and placed it in a small wooden box, along with the hospital wristband, not to hide them, but to honor them, artifacts of a story that no longer controlled me. Before bed, I opened the terminal project master file one last time that day. The mission statement sat at the top of the page. No child disappears quietly. I added a second line beneath it, and no survivor remains. Silent. Then I closed the laptop, turned off the light, and laid down, not as a ghost, not as a victim, not as a case, but as a woman who owned every part of her name.